Hello everyone! So in this video we are looking at language, form and structure. So for those of you who have been studying English literature for a while, these terms are probably not alien to you. A lot of students are actually able to analyse the use of language quite well in their literary analysis. When it comes to form and structure, however, these terms tend to confuse a lot of students, and because they confuse students, I think a lot of people tend to shy away from engaging with form and structure when it comes to writing analysis. And that is a real shame, because the ability to write well on form and structure is actually usually what gives students a leg up in exams. And a lot of the real gems in literary analysis actually fall under structure. But the catch is, we often have to be able to identify certain formal traits of a specific text before we can really grapple with the specifics of structure. Now, it's not always the case that form and structure are related, but most of the time, form determines structure, most of the time, okay? And even if it's a case where the form doesn't determine structure, the structure is usually the kind of building blocks of a poetic form or a prose form. So anyway, let's dive straight into the specifics of these three terms, and hopefully this video will help clear things up for you all. So let's start with language. So when it comes to language, we're really looking at literary devices and figurative descriptions. And I like to think about language in four main buckets. And they're comparative devices, which really refers to your simile, metaphor, analogy, and to a certain extent, personification and hyperbole. And then the second group, the second bucket, refers to contrasting devices. So that's really your contrast, antithesis, paradox, oxymoron, etc. And then the third bucket, your sonic devices, which is obviously about the use of sound in poetry. And so that's your alliteration, assonance, consonants, onomatopoeia, etc. And so the fourth bucket is the use of imagery, right? And a lot of students tend to be confused about what imagery really means. So imagery is actually a result of groups of words that share a similar idea, and that's why I always like to think of diction as being the foundation of imagery. So some of the more common buckets of imagery would be sensory imagery, kinesthetic imagery, organic imagery, or sometimes, the more obvious types would be color imagery or animal imagery, etc. Right? So really that's your four main buckets in language. So now let's move on to form. So in literary analysis, when it comes to form, we're mostly looking at the type or the genre of a poem or a prose excerpt. So some of the common poetic forms we usually see include the ballad, the sonnet, the ode, the villanelle, etc. So just to show you guys what a ballad looks like. So here's a poem that I taken from poets.org, which is a great resource for poetry, by the way. Highly recommend it. So here, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who is one of the big sixes in the Romanticist period, one of the big six poets. So one thing you notice about his ballad is that it's actually very long. And the reason for that is that ballads are narrative poems. So what that means is they tell a story. So it's almost as if you are thinking about a novel in poetry form. So that's why ballads tend to be quite long. They usually aren't as long as an epic. So say, for example, something like Paradise Lost by John Milton, which is famously book length, right? But it's a poem, but it's made up of 12 books, right? So, well, they call them books, but it's actually sectioned off into chapters. But, if you combine all of the chapters, all of the 12 chapters, really, you just have a book-length poem. So that's an epic. The ballad isn't as long, but there you go. It's still a long poem by any standards. And then just now I mentioned the term villanelle. So the villanelle, a good example of that is "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night," which is a poem by Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet. This is a very famous poem as well. And the villanelle is actually a very formally restricted kind of poem. So what that means is it's always made up of 19 lines, comprised of 5 tercets meaning 3-line stanzas, and it ends with 1 quatrain. So that's the 4-line stanza at the end. So that's a villanelle for you. You don't tend to come across villanelles, I think, in a lot of unseen poetry exercises. And even if you do, don't worry too much about necessarily being able to identify that, it's an example of a villanelle, because always remember, what really gets you marks isn't necessarily your ability to identify a formal or a linguistic or a stylistic or a structural trait, even though that's super important. But what really is going to get you the mark is your ability to analyse intelligently how that linguistic or formal or structural trait is used, right? And so when it comes to the sonnet, which I've actually written a post about here, I will put the link to this post in the description box for this video. But a sonnet is traditionally a love poem, but it doesn't always have to be, actually. And it could be about different kinds of love, right? It could be about romantic love, but it could also be about fraternal love or self-love or love for God. Especially some of the later examples of sonnets that don't necessarily always have to be about love in the traditional sense. But most of the time you would come across 2 main types of sonnets. So Petrarchan and the Shakespearean, and both are made up of 14 lines, but they have their respective differences, which if you're interested in finding out more about, you can take a look at this post. But you have other types of sonnets, like the Spenserian sonnet, named after Edmund Spenser, another Renaissance poet, and then you have the Miltonic sonnet, named after John Milton, right, who's the poet that wrote Paradise Lost, the one I just mentioned, the epic I've just mentioned. And then you have other examples like Curtal sonnets, which you have people like Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Gerard Manley Hopkins, Victorian poets who have also written. So these are just some examples of the sonnet. And then another thing I think to pay attention to is the shape of the poem. So a lot of students tend to find this a bit confusing. Like, what does it mean to look at the shape of the poem? Well, really, it's very simple. It's just to think about, well, what does this poem look like to me? Does it look like a specific shape, right? And so a good illustration of this is Easter Wings by George Herbert, who is a famous metaphysical poet. And the first thing you probably notice about this poem is that it's organized in a rather specific way, right? And it's very visual, and you notice that the lines kind of taper inwards once they get to the middle section of the stanza, and then they fan outwards again. And this is, of course, to mirror the idea of wings, right? And so if you think about it, it basically looks like a pair of butterfly wings, right? So there you go. So that's an example of concrete poetry where, there's definitely something to the shape that you can talk about. And then there's the haiku, which doesn't always have to show up in a specific shape. But the fact that it follows a 5-7-5 syllable structure, 5-7-5 per line, by the way, per line in 3 lines structure, sometimes it ends up looking like a diamante structure. Sometimes it ends up looking like a diamond with the middle line jutting out on both ends. And so that's also related to the shape of the poem. And then when it comes to prose forms, that's usually when we're looking at things that are, say, from a specific kind of prose work. So, say the epistolary novel, right, which is if you're looking at like a letter. or if it's a diaristic entry, it's a diaristic novel, it's a novel that's made up of many diary entries, and that's a diaristic form. Or if you have short story and gothic novels, etc. These are all terms that would fall under the pillar of form. And then finally, we come to structure. And as you can tell, structure is actually a very large piece in literary analysis, which is why whenever I see students shy away from talking about structure, I just feel like it's a massive, massive shame. So really, structure is rather simple in terms of the general idea. It's really about how a text is organized, how a text is arranged. Earlier on in the video, I mentioned that it's structure, it's the building blocks. Whenever we think about structural traits, as loaded a phrase as that sounds, it really is just the building blocks of a text, right? What the units that make up a text. So when it comes to poetry, that would be your stanzas. So whether or not a stanza is made up of 4 lines, 3 lines, or 5 lines, or 6, 7, 8, etc., etc., you'd call them the quatrain, tercet, cinquain, etc. Say, for example, when it comes to a villanelle, it's always a combination of 5 tercets plus 1 quatrain, right? So say, if we didn't know that, right, if we didn't know the structural terms for the stanzas, then we wouldn't be able to actually talk about the form, and vice versa, really. So you can see the synergy between form and structure. It's really important there. And so another aspect in structure is syntax. So really that concerns word order. So some of the syntactical devices that we often encounter would be anaphora, hyperbaton, asyndeton, parallelism, etc., etc. There's loads more, but this is just a handful of syntactical devices that I think we often see, especially actually when it comes to some of the more rhetorical texts. And so anaphora is the repetition of the first word or phrase in successive lines or clauses, right? Hyperbaton would be the inversion of word order, the inversion of normal word order. Asyndeton, the absence of connectives, right? And so the opposite of asyndeton would be polysyndeton, actually, where you have the use of a lot of connectives. Ernest Hemingway is a famous author who's known for his use of polysyndeton. And then parallelism is really just about kind of matching up the parts of speech, putting the same part of speech in successive clauses or lines. And then when it comes to line and sentence length, that's obviously also super important when it comes to poetry analysis. And that's usually just made up of enjambment or enjambment, because this is a French term, and also the use of caesura. So when it comes to enjambment, that's the use of run-on lines, and then the opposite of that is caesura, which is the use of stops and pauses. I always think that it's most rewarding to discuss enjambment and caesura together in your analysis, because it really often is the interplay between these two devices that really creates an effect. So I always encourage students to analyze them together. And then there's rhyme scheme, right, which a lot of you are familiar with. Some of the more common types of rhyme schemes would be envelope rhymes, alternate rhymes, end rhymes, rhyming couplets, chain rhymes, etc., etc. When it comes to, say, something like the sonnet, it follows a specific rhyme scheme, right? You know, Petrarchan versus Shakespearean sonnets, they follow different rhyme schemes, but there you go. You know, that's another structural. There's another structural piece of information that you'd have to know in order to talk about the form. And then when it comes to meter and prosody, I think this is probably, for a lot of students, this is probably the hardest. And I think there's a couple of reasons for why students tend to find prosody so scary, is because when it comes to meter and prosody, there's quite a lot of technical terms just within prosody that you actually have to know, right? Things like iambs, trochees, dactyls, spondees, anapaests, etc., etc. And then also it takes time to really do the scanning, right? In terms of, say, how many meters are there in each line? what are the metrical units, etc. Iambic pentameter is the most popular, I think, or it's the most natural form of meter in English literature. That's just to do with the way English, there's the stress and unstress falls in the English language, but there are obviously other types, other combinations of meter and stress, right? So I really encourage you guys to take a look at my post on how to analyze rhythm, which I will put the link to in the description box as well, for a more specific insight into how you can analyze rhythm, meter, and foot in poetry. So when it comes to prose and structure in prose, it's really talking about things like paragraphs or chapters, sentence and chapter lengths, and also narrative devices. So narrative devices is another one of those mammoth topics that really deserves an entire post or entire book on its own, actually. And this really concerns the use of linear narrative, flashback, prolepsis, which like flash forward, twist ending, etc., etc. There's loads more. And then obviously you also have things like point of view, such as third person, omniscience, focalization, interior monologue. These are devices that modernist writers like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce often use. But yeah, but largely these are some of the main aspects that would fall under structure. So that's it, guys. I hope that helped. And specifically, I hope you now know what it is that you need to be looking out for whenever it comes to looking at language, form, and structure in your literary analysis. Please do like this video and subscribe to this channel, and also check out my blog posts for more learning tips and study resources on English literature. Please also, if possible, leave a comment in the comment section down below and let me know what are some of the topics that you'd like to learn more about from this channel and what it is that you struggle with. I'll speak to you soon. Bye!